Alright, so in this video, I'm going to explain the basics of Swirl, as well as how it scales with multiple enemies. At the end of the video, I will also be explaining the conditions of Swirl and how you can optimize its damage. To explain the basics of Swirl, I will be using this clip that I saved here. So now, what does Swirl actually do? Basically, it spreads the initial element around the enemy, while also causing damage to nearby enemies. So note that this enemy in front of Venti has the electro debuff on him currently, and just see what happens when I use Venti's elemental skill. So if you look at the top of the enemy's head that I just hit, you can see that Swirl is actually triggered when you combine Anemo with any existing element. But also note that Anemo can never be the initial element, so that means that whenever you see a Swirl proc, it is always triggered by the Anemo character. So before I go into the damage numbers, there are a few things to clarify first. This Swirl text in green does not actually represent the 1817 damage in green. The 1817 damage actually represents Venti's skill damage, so you can just ignore this. The number that you want to look at is actually the 478 in purple, which represents the damage of Swirl. So the color of the Swirl text indicator will always be green, but the color of Swirl damage will depend on the initial element used to trigger Swirl. So in this case, I triggered Anemo with Electro, which means that Swirl did 478 Electro damage to nearby enemies. Also, if you look at the enemy on the left, even though he's not caught in Venti's skill, he also got hit by the Swirl that triggered on the right for 478 damage. So now that you understand how Swirl works, this next clip will show you how it scales with more enemies, which is where Swirl actually shines in damage. So here I used Venti's elemental skill to hit the two enemies on the right side, effectively triggering Swirl on both the slime and the mage. To calculate the total amount of Swirl damage instances, just take the amount of triggers multiplied by the number of enemies nearby. In this case, I triggered Swirl on 2 enemies while there are 3 enemies nearby. So when you multiply these two numbers, you get a total of 6 Swirl damage instances. Okay, so just to add on to this, if there are 5 enemies and you proc Swirl on all 5 of them, that would be a total of 25 damage instances of Swirl. Okay, so now that Swirl is done, in this next segment, I'll be showing some of the interactions that I've just found. Before I play this clip, this big guy over here has the electro debuff on him. It's just that you can't see it now because of the camera angle. Another thing is, do take note of his axe. Right now it's flaming or on fire or whatever you want to call it. So just watch as I play this clip and use Venti's skill. As I mentioned earlier, this big guy has the electro debuff, so as I used my skill, I procced Swirl that did 478 electro damage to him and the enemy on the right. Now I want you to look at his axe and you can probably tell that it's not on fire anymore. What happened here was that I actually triggered Swirl on 2 elements. The first being the electro that was initially on the big guy, and I also triggered Swirl with the pyro element in his axe. This is why the small hilichurl on the right took both the electro and pyro elements, which means that I actually triggered Overload as an additional effect of triggering Swirl on the big guy and his flaming axe. Alright, now at this point you already know that Swirl can do huge damage if there are multiple enemies, and you're probably thinking of trying to proc Swirl on like 10 enemies to get 100 Swirl damage instances and whatnot. But before you go ahead and build Elemental Mastery with your Viridescent set, you do need to know a few things. As I said at the start of the video, there are certain conditions that will impact the damage of Swirl, and firstly, Transformative Elemental Reactions, which includes Swirl but not Melt or Vaporize, do not scale with attack and also cannot crit. They only scale with the character's level and their Elemental Mastery. Secondly, there is currently a debate on internal cooldowns for elemental reactions, but from what I have personally tested, if I constantly trigger Overload during Venti's burst, I can confirm that proccing Overload does reduce the amount of Swirl procs. And lastly, Viridescent's extra 60% Swirl damage is additive and not multiplicative. So for example, if I currently have an additional 72.4% that comes from my Elemental Mastery, this 72.4% will add 60% from the Viridescent set, which is a total of 132.4%. Alright, so now that all this is done, just let me know what you think, like if I was talking too slowly or quickly, or if I wasn't clear enough, just leave it in the comments. I will be going back to making my Venti guide, and I honestly just made this because I wanted to answer most of the questions that I got in my previous video. So that's it for this video, thanks for watching.